to the seminar than Blaine Pardoe. Blaine, come join us.
Burt Hall. Wow, what a great way to kick off any discussion with aviation historians. Just out of curiosity, how many people in here have heard of Burt Hall? See, and he would be so pleased. If Burt were here today, he'd tell you that I'm about to tell you about the most influential, charismatic, skilled aviator of the Lafayette Escadrille. And you would all say, gee, that's not quite the history I've heard. I've spent 3 years doing research on this project. It has been a blast, and I'm going to try to make it as funny as possible, which fortunately I'm working with good material.
It's not reaching it.
It was the reach. Very good. The Burt Hall of legend. For those of you who have heard of Burt, we've all formed various opinions of him. Vague, somewhat questionable background prior to the start of the war, which I have been able to kind of cut through a little bit, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. One of the original members of the Escadrille Americaine. He did secure victories with the Escadrille, despite what several historians have tried to argue over the years. He did leave the unit under dubious circumstances. There's always been a question of whether Burt was run out of the Escadrille or whether Burt left in a huff. I think the answer is both. He did continue to fly. He did secure more victories. A lot of people have always questioned, did Burt really go to Romania? Did Burt really go to Russia? Things along those lines. And the answers are yes. Actually, we've been able to kind of validate quite a bit of that. Was Burt a deserter to the air service, the French air service? Yes, and I will tell you that the French Foreign Legion is still a little bit ticked about. Every time I dealt with them, they were like, why are you doing this about this man who is a known deserter? And they're still a little bit mad, but it was kind of fun from that perspective. He allegedly wrote 2 autobiographies. I'm going to dispel the myth on that a little bit. Starred in silent films. Went to China as a mercenary, was arrested and found guilty as part of a fraudulent arms sale, and was the last of the original members to die. I always liked what captivated me about Burt. I had been working on the book Lost Eagles, which was about Frederick Zinn. When I came across a quote that in Zinn's files that he had attributed to Burt that said, "Them that love me well, them that don't can go to hell," I thought a man that eloquent deserved the play. All right. A little bit about the research. Grand challenge that I had was Burt's 2 autobiographies, which don't match. One Man's War, which was written later, which we'll talk about, and LNR. Those things were really, they don't match in the least, which has always been part of the reason that a lot of historians have discredited Mr. Hall. Hopefully I'll tell you a little bit about that. I tried to go to archival resources as much as possible, and that was a real challenge. I did come across some things that really altered my opinion of Burt. Now, you probably come away saying Blaine likes Burt. He's a reprobate. You can't like him. But there's something so honest and sincere about the guy that you end up having a lot of respect for Burt when you come through this. What really surprised me out of all of this was the rivalry that Paul Rockwell had. Alan Tully kind of steered me down to Washington and Lee University. There's 26 boxes of Paul Rockwell's records there. If you've never done research into the Escadrille, you've got to go there. And I spent 2 days down there just reading up on how Paul Rockwell hated Burt Hall, which was a lot of fun. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It was definitely a one-way rivalry, which made it even more entertaining. Rockwell hated Hall. I don't think Hall really cared one way or another about Rockwell. So I'll do that. Let's see if we can go here. A little bit about Burt Hall. It was kind of a surprise. I always like digging into the genealogy of anybody I'm doing. Turns out Burt actually came from a family of kind of heroic people. He had relatives that fought in the Revolutionary War, and surprisingly, they fought for the Americans. I just catch the joke. His great-great-grandfather served in distinction in several battles, including Pyle's Massacre, which was an interesting battle because it was a group of cavalrymen that were from the Carolinas that rode into a camp. They thought they were Carleton's men because of the green coats they were wearing, and it was actually the Americans, and then they slaughtered them while they were standing next to them. Little questionable, but kind of a typical battle for that southern campaign. His father had served under General Shelby and had gone on Shelby's exodus down into Mexico. George Hall did. There's actually a lot of written accounts of George Hall during that period. But he went down for the Confederate exodus, and Shelby came back. He moved to Missouri, and literally Hall was raised shortly, very short distance from there. As a matter of fact, I found the newspaper article for Shelby's death. One of the men that was at his bedside was Burt Hall's dad, and he served as a pallbearer for General Shelby. He was actually his assistant. So his father was, for those of you who know assistants and aide-de-camps in the Civil War, his father was literally standing next to Shelby, who was always at the front. So it was a very, very precarious thing. So from these audacious and wonderful circumstances, we end up with the character known as Burt Hall. Thank you. Despite the myth of legends about where Burt Hall was born, I've heard 5 different locations from Kentucky to Eagle Pass, Texas. I was able to finally confirm that he was born in Higginsville, Missouri. Why Burt always told a different story about that, I think he just liked jerking people around. That was part of his mystique. Some of the things I really found interesting when you started digging into this, we've all heard the stories or read the versions of Burt's life where at various times he was a human cannonball. He was an auto race car driver. Well, it turns out a lot of these actually did have kernels of truth tied to them. In 1906, he was working for a circus. He was listed, though, on their payroll as a marketer, which meant he did one of 2 things. He was either the person that put up the playbills in town that said the circus was in town, or he was a caller for the various shows, step right up, do those things. There's absolutely no record that he was ever fired out of a cannon, despite some of the myth around that. Burt, he left home at a very early age, around 14 years old. He returned home in 1907. When he did return home, he married his first wife, and by the way, we will need to keep track of these. Burt married his first wife, who was only 15 at the time. I did find that Burt had a perchance for younger women, always. He then ended up for a while in San Francisco as a chauffeur. Then in Kansas City, he was driving for Cashmere Welch, driving a car as a chauffeur. Now, Cashmere Welch was a political boss. They literally called it the Tammany Hall of Missouri, the stuff that he did. So Burt was really more of a thug and a driver than he was anything else, but he did serve in there. I never found a divorce for the first wife, and you really have to work this way with Burt. But he did marry in 1910 in Kansas City, Emily Harris Levy. He did end, we never found a divorce for her, but Burt, that didn't seem to slow him down, as you'll see. Burt then did get a job in Galveston, Texas, where he was doing auto racing. I found newspaper articles from the period. They used to do races on the beach at Galveston, and Burt Hall was one of the race car drivers. And kind of a remarkable thing. He did travel with that family, the Kempner family, to Europe, and was there. Now, he told the family, I found an interview that they gave during the war, he told them that he was leaving their employment to go fight in the Balkans. Now, this will always stir people up. I will tell you, I have contacted the Balkans, the various governments that made up the Balkans. I contacted the Turkish archives, because Burt, in his second autobiography, had always claimed that he was the first aviation flyer, combat flyer. He flew in the Balkans War. I have confirmed it with all the government archives. They have no record of Burt Hall ever showing up and flying for them. But you have to bear in mind, that came out of his second autobiography, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, how that gets framed historically, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Burt. Burt was one of those interesting fellows. Thank you.
I'll just do it from now on.
It's fun to watch. Burt was one of those interesting fellows. I was talking to somebody last night. I said he was always in the right place at the right time, and somebody said, or the wrong place at the wrong time. He was in Paris. He was driving a taxi cab at the time when the war broke out. He had been hanging around with the Americans at the hotel, Royale. They started, as we know, Americans were all highly motivated, 43 of them, to go ahead and join the Foreign Legion. Burt did join the Legion. I found a fascinating account that he wrote for the New York Times during that period. And I mean, it was a long account of what he did during his period in the Legion before he went into aviation. Absolutely fascinating. He was wounded at least once while he was in the Legion. Now, Paul Rockwell always claimed that was a lie, but I have found some substantive evidence that Burt Hall was indeed wounded. Like a few of the men at that period, he did lie his way into aviation. For the record, Thaw did as well. Thaw claimed his last name was Calderon, so that Burt always gets painted as the bad guy for lying his way into aviation, but a lot of the guys did to get out of that fighting. And Hall's in the upper corner of that picture, looking away. And the others are all holding onto their wallets. In the French Air Service, Burt immediately aroused suspicion. He started bragging about a bayonet charge that he was involved in. The men knew that the Legion had not been involved in a bayonet charge. So they immediately sent some spies to sleep on both sides of his bunk to see what he was up to. And you got to bear in mind, he did crash an aircraft, the account that we've all heard about before, I'm sure many of you have, where Burt claimed that he could fly an airplane, climbed into it, had never flown an airplane before, and crashed it into the barn, and they said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I just thought I'd pick it up, and they thought, well, we'll keep him in. That didn't help with the whole spy thing, because they thought maybe this guy's a saboteur. But Burt actually went through his aviation training and was posted to M38. And there weren't any combat kills that were secured during that period, but M38 did fly a number of missions during that period. And for those who remember some of the earlier aviators, where they would fly missions behind the enemy lines, land the aircraft, drop off saboteurs, and then pick them up. I didn't find anything particular that pinned Burt to those types of missions, but we know those missions were flown by that escadrille. He always had claimed that he had done that.
The first American to fall in German hands was engaged in one of those missions with MS-38, Louis Byers.
Yeah. First American prisoner of war was in that. So there's definitely substantive evidence that Burt did fly those types of missions. He was made an instructor at Evar. He actually instructed Campbell in his flying. That was there. This is where it gets a little interesting. I did find out he married, and I've now had to number them. Wife number 3, 16-year-old French girl, Suzanne Titian. He did marry her, and it is interesting because throughout that period we've all heard the stories that Burt was notorious for going to the brothels when he was with the escadrille, but he was married to her and she was living outside the base, so I don't know if it was, there's two possibilities. Either Burt was going home to his wife and he never told the men in the escadrille about his wife, or Burt was going to the brothels. And with Bert, I'm not going to tell you it was one or the other because it could have gone either way. You know, on April 16th, his name was not on the original list for the Escadrille Americana. It was added in I think, the third pass, but Bert's name finally appeared on that original list, which entitled him to that his claim that he was one of the original members. Click. You know, he really did, you know, it's remarkable, and even Paul Rockwell begrudgingly will say, you know, during his early days with the Escadrille that Bert did do a remarkable job. He secured the second victory for the unit on 22nd of May. As far as I've been able to pin down, this is the aviator that he took down, as close as I can get to that. He did secure another victory on the 23rd, and he claimed a victory on the 24th that remains kind of questionable at this point. But Bert was an aviator who saw combat, and there are numerous accounts. I found he gave a lot of newspaper interviews during the period, as did many of the men of the Escadrille. And there are many accounts of Bert's heroic actions. Some of them were less heroic than others. Some of the newspaper accounts were, oh, there's this new Yankee trick called hiding in the clouds. And it surprised the Germans. The Americans invented this. I don't quite buy that, but you get the idea that, you know, there was quite a bit going on. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of detail about these because these are not spectacular victories by any stretch. And even Bert will tell you in the one case, on the one that for the 24th, he said, gee, I squeezed off 2 bullets and the plane went down. You know, I guess I was lucky, you know, but even then he kind of downplayed it. We'll go ahead and go on. You know, there's a lot of falling out of eagles. That's kind of fun when you think about it. Bert, you know, Bert did not necessarily fit in with the image of the Lafayette Escadrille and the men that were there. At Kiffin's death, according to Paul Rockwell, he rushed off to the Paris office of the New York Times and other American journalists and peddled the story of his comrade's death to the newspapers. Now, for the record, Bert wasn't there when Kiffin was killed. They were actually in Paris at the time. But according to Paul Rockwell, who his venom for Bert really begins at this point, Bert was out selling that story. By the way, I found absolutely nothing to back that up. I've checked with all the articles, all the references I could find to newspaper articles about Kiffin's death, and there's none that quote Burt Hall or have any reference to Hall or anything else. The truth is, there were a number of men in the Escadrille that were in Paris at the time. All of them went back to the Escadrille. Bert did not. He stayed there, and I think the assumption was that he was out peddling his story, and whether that really happened or not, I haven't been able to find proof of that. That seemed to be the turning point between Paul Rockwell and Bert. That's where things completely changed. Up until that point, he had nothing but praise for Bert. As a matter of fact, he acted almost like Bert's press agent in many respects, like he did all the members of the Escadrille. At Prince's death, Bert was present, and you can see him sitting at the end there in the photograph for that. But as we've all seen, there's been a lot of photographs where you tend to see Burt Hall in a photograph. He's always standing about 5 feet over. There definitely was some bad blood. There was talk of, in one letter, it was very interesting, that we need to consider giving Bert the cure, which is what they referred to. The cure was what they gave Cowden, which was where the men drove him out of the Escadrille. There was talk of that. That came from our wonderful aviator from Virginia, who was pushing for this. It was very much a fraternity type situation, and Bert didn't fit that situation. Now, there's a lot of accounts that Bert was kiting checks, that he was stealing money from his squadron mates, that he was cheating at cards. I will tell you, Bert was a card player his whole life. He actually made a living for a while playing bridge tournaments. I have no doubt in my mind he cheated at cards. Did he take money from these guys? Absolutely. I have no problem dealing with that. And I think from his perspective is they had money and it was worth doing. Now, Paul Rockwell, at this time, Bert in his second autobiography, claims that he had been shot in the mouth and had lost several of his teeth. Now, anybody who just tries to figure out the mechanics of shooting out your mouth without having a bullet hit you in the face or leave scars on your cheeks, the mechanics of that are pretty hard. Bert's claim, I did find an article where he claimed that he was having dental problems during that period and having teeth pulled. Paul Rockwell's version is Bert was having his teeth pulled to avoid doing flying, at the time. For those of you who've read Alan's wonderful article about the flying times, of the Escadrille, the early part of the Escadrille, it was in a recent issue of Over the Front. Great article. It spurred me to go through and pull up the actual log to see how much did Bert fly. He was flying in the lower third of the number of people that were flying during the period, but there were a lot of people in the Escadrille that flew a lot less than Bert. So I don't think Bert was shirking away the way Paul Rockwell kind of painted it. I also don't believe any of the accounts that Bert was shot in the mouth. If anybody can figure out the angles you can do that without scarring, I'd love to hear it. We'll go ahead. Bert finally bid adieu to the men of the Escadrille. Now, there's two accounts of this that are the prevalent ones. One is that they basically kicked him out, told him to leave. The other is that Bert said, "I'll see you later, I'm out of here." I tend to think it falls into that. John will remember the quote better than I do, but
"You'll hear from me yet." Well, he was right.
He was right. And what was interesting was he left and literally walked across to where N-103 was posted at the same aerodrome. So he didn't go far. They still shared a mess, etc. So they did. And there are letter accounts where they said, "Oh, we saw Bert in the mess today," etc. So they still recognized he was there. He did receive a citation for a kill on the 6th of November, and a second citation, which I posted up here. I like the description of him as clever and energetic. Clever, I definitely would give you to Burt Hall. Daily attacking enemy planes at a very short distance. Shot down a German plane at 200 meters from our trenches. Again, while Bert is often portrayed by most accounts as being kind of a coward at this stage, what we see is when he goes to N-103, he jumps right into combat. He's actually flying with under an officer that he flew with in M38. And so the guy knew what he was getting. He had dealt with Bert earlier in the war. We just don't really get that feeling that Bert was this coward, although there will be some times I get to change that. As we go on, Bert received an opportunity to go to the French mission to Romania. Now, the French mission to Romania had already taken off. For those of you who don't understand the political context, Romania was always on the verge of collapse. France sent in tons of arms, aircraft, artillery, etc. Of course, all the aircraft they sent were obsoleted aircraft, but they were there to prop up the Romanians. Bert showed up about 3 weeks after the mission went. It's interesting. I did manage to get the French records of the Romanian mission as much as they are there. They actually sent me a thing saying, "We still have not fully documented this." I'm like, well, it's only been 100 years. But he did allegedly shoot down 2 aircraft. The one city,
Menelkov,
drove me nuts. I couldn't find it. If you look on the map today, you can't find it. I had to dig up about a 1912 map, and it was a small village in Russia. It's one of those that disappeared during the Stalin era. So they definitely were there. I found several interviews that Bert gave while in Romania. He definitely was in Romania, and he was definitely doing the flying. They never have fully accredited him with those victories, however, but they are listed in the summary document that you can pull of the Romanian mission. Bert, classic Bert form, made his way to Russia and to Petersburg. Only Bert could end up in Petersburg during the Russian Revolution. I found State Department records. Bert went to the American Embassy and requested a loan to travel back to the United States. He claimed that he had served in Company K of the 6th Missouri Cavalry during the Spanish-American War. Lied through his teeth, by the way. You know, I felt so stupid pulling up those records just to verify, but I had to check. But Burt never served in the Spanish-American War. But he told a great story. They actually loaned him the money. Boy, were they stupid. Never made it back. The only thing I can tell you is there is absolutely nothing to substantiate Burt's autobiographical accounts where he smuggled millions of dollars of royal gems out of Russia. But he did travel out of Russia, all the way across Russia during the Revolution, and traveled out to Vladivostok. Terrible. So, Burt, his claim was, and he told the French, this is actually in his records from the Foreign Legion. For Burt did tell the French that he was going back to enlist in the American Air Force. And that's what he also told the American ambassador, going back to go join the American Air Service. He did try. He was rejected for health reasons. Failed his physical. Hard to believe. You know, a lot of these guys had seen combat for a long time, but as we all know, a number of those men in the Escadrille, such as Thaw, didn't pass their physicals. And it found a great article that kind of detailed some of those men that did that. Burt, instead of returning to the unit where he should have done, since he didn't join the French Air Service, he should have gone back to France and joined the unit. Burt decided to stay in the United States. He went on to film a movie called A Romance in the Air. It is a movie about the Lafayette Escadrille starring Burt Hall, written by Burt Hall, produced by Burt Hall. It's a Burt Hall production. They filmed it up in New York. It's an interesting silent movie to watch. It also is the best way to validate what medals Burt actually had, because there's a scene where they show the medals and explain each medal that he had. The medal list you'll find over the years got added to. You know, so he was obviously picking some up or surplus. But he then went on to write Eleanor, his first autobiography, to really kind of emphasize how things were going for Burt. The French reached out to the FBI because Burt was doing, when the movie appeared, A Romance in the Air, it didn't just show the movie. Burt came and talked at the movie. And he talked about all his exploits, and he wore his uniform and his medals. Then they showed the movie, and it really added to it. And that's literally how that movie traveled around. And it was a big hit. Considering it came out in October, November 1918, when the war was really wrapping up, Burt was one of those guys that everyone had heard about. The FBI came after him because the French said he had no right to wear the uniform because he was technically a deserter. The FBI told the French, there's no law in our books about wearing a foreign uniform, so there's nothing we can do about it. The FBI was then contacted by his wife, Suzanne, and said that he had abandoned him and their daughter, Nadine, and they wanted to be in contact with Mr. Hall for financial restitution. That didn't seem to slow down Burt, by the way. He never seemed to reach back out to Suzanne or his daughter Nadine, which comes up later. He did marry Della Byers, who was a vaudeville performer. And while she is giving birth to Weston Burt Hall Jr., Burt left her to marry Helen Marie Jordan, who then had 6 months later another child by the same name. And I got to tell you, from a genealogical standpoint, I worked with a genealogist. She went nuts with it. She said, I got on one coast, they're both being born at different times, and it took us a while to figure it out. But divorce wasn't something that slowed Burt down. And I'm going to ask the ladies in the room, what is his appeal? And my wife has a suggestion that's part of the camera we can't see it. He obviously could talk the pants off almost any woman, and did. Burt was also very, how can I put this? He went forth and multiplied. There's a lot of Hall children floating around. We'll go ahead and go to the next one. This is a promotional shot, actually, and it was funny because Alan kind of tipped me onto this shot, and I found it in the Smithsonian with the film. So it was a promotional shot they did for the movie that he did, A Romance in the Air. He filmed another movie called The Border Scouts. It was an abysmal failure. It showed 3 times. It's a missing film. No one knows where it is. It was about a bunch of Boy Scouts that went down to the Mexican border and killed Mexicans that came across the border. The raid. They were using machine guns. I mean, I don't think it would play today. But, you know, a classic movie from the period. In 1927, you know, Burt had actually got into doing long-distance flying. He actually had secured a manufacturer to build him an airplane to try to fly across the Pacific. It was all during the craze in that period of what was going on, literally, with the flights of Lindbergh, while you had on the West Coast Bert Hall, and there was a lot of articles about this. Bert Hall was going to go fly the Pacific. He was actually beat out by a couple of Australians that made the flight, but he was really pushing to do this. Kind of crazy, I can't imagine an aircraft manufacturer giving Bert Hall an aircraft. It was interesting, as you get into the 1920s, you get close to, 28 was the creation of the memorial for the Lafayette Flying Corps and Escadrille. I personally, it was interesting to go through Paul Rockwell's papers on this, because of all the original aviators, there's a few that are omitted from the official memorial. Burt Hall is one of them. Rose and Rockwell really conspired to keep out a handful of people. Eugene Bullard, we were talking about this last night, was kept out because he was black. Rose had no problem with that, neither did Rockwell. They were very unabashed in the documentation. He was being kept out because he was black. Wright was a deserter. Cowden was considered a coward/deserter and had been driven out of the Escadrille. And Burt, they didn't want in there because they considered him a reprobate. And quite literally, there was no reason for him to really be omitted, other than Paul Rockwell claimed, well, we can't have deserters on here, tainting this memorial, which really was kind of sad. There's always an often told story, and I spent a lot of time looking for this, and it's perpetuated primarily by Paul Rockwell, that when they dedicated the memorial in 1928, there was a chair for Burt and a chair for Mrs. Hall, and that 3 women showed up claiming to be Mrs. Hall, and they got into a fight, one beating one over the head with a purse. I never found that account outside of Paul Rockwell, but I also have no problem believing it. I'm sure if you were trying to track down Burt Hall, that if you were one of his ex-wives, that's a place you might show up. But there's absolutely no written account that really substantiates.
Were they ex-wives?
Pardon?
Were they ex-wives?
Well, not all of them. And it gets funnier. Let's go ahead. Now, how many people have read One Man's War and hated it? You know, John Jacob Niles, who is an author of many books on American music folklore, allegedly co-wrote with Burt Hall One Man's War. And that really created the whole myth of Burt flying in the Balkans War. It created the whole myth of Burt sleeping with Mata Hari. It doesn't match up with any known accounts of the Lafayette Escadrille or his previous autobiography. I tracked down John Jacob Niles' papers. They're at the University of Kentucky. They actually have a whole wing of their library dedicated to this guy. And I pulled up all the Hall correspondence. And you guys are going to love this because it's a great story. Burt was being scammed by John Jacob Niles. He had met him in 1918, turned over his diaries and books to him. And he wanted him to help him sell a short story that he had written. And Niles said, let's do it. Except that Burt went to China. Niles wrote up One Man's War and sold it, but never told Burt. So Burt literally has letters that he's written from China going, when did this book come out? When can I get a copy to look at it? Terrible title. Went on with it, and he said, how much money are we getting from this? Of course, this was 1929, October, when the stock markets crashed. So Burt was more focused on how do I get the money from this. Now, for the record, Bert turned the tables on Niles. He went to the bank with a letter he had typed up that he claimed was from the publisher for an advance of $1,000. And he went to the American Express Bank in China and actually got them to get the money. So now the publisher got involved going, this guy's drawing $1,000 off an account in China. They were going after Niles, and they're like, you better get a lawyer, and he better get a lawyer. It took them 3 years to work out the payment piece. I always thought it was pretty good because Niles really scammed Burt Hall. To do that was remarkable. But it really explains a lot. For those of you who have always said, one man's war, kind of proves Burt Hall was a fraud. Bert never even saw the book until it was already in print. It's a complete piece of fiction. You could throw it away, I'm sorry, it's got to go to the fiction file. But it was pretty funny to find out that someone had scammed Burt Hall. I have to admire that. We'll go ahead. Only Bert could, what was that saying? Only Nixon could go to China? Only Bert could go to China. Yeah, China was kind of like the wild, wild west after the war. You had a lot of aviation pioneers and pilots from the war who went over there. Each one of the city-states was forming their own air force. They had their own army. There were civil wars going on. It was a perfect place for Burt Hall to go. Burt Hall went over there, claimed to be an aviation expert. He was, by their standards. He actually got involved with the nationalist effort. Ernie Pyle broke the story on Bert. It said this man that's claiming to be a Chinese general, General Hui Chang, is actually Bert Hall of the Lafayette Escadrille. And Bert went over there. He got involved, and I found some State Department records where he was trying to sell some Corsair aircraft, some Voight Corsairs. He didn't actually have a license to sell the aircraft, but he was competing and outbidding all the other sellers. So there's a lot of things that flew back and forth on that. Bert was, when the Joliet mission went, the American mission went to China to take a look at their aviation situation. The representative for China had Burt Hall sit in on the meeting to represent the Chinese Air Force. It was just absolutely mind-boggling. He was involved with Eugene Shoemaker, another pilot from the Great War. They actually ran air operations out of Hangzhou. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it was a classic Burt Hall maneuver. I mean, he was literally in the midst of all this. There's absolutely no record that he climbed in an aircraft and flew a mission, for the record. But he was definitely hip deep in running those operations. I like the picture over there, thank God for eBay. Great picture of Burt Hall, an unknown Chinese officer, and Robert Short. Those of you who know Robert Short, American kind of renowned for fighting the Japanese for the Chinese over there, shot down, was made a hero, really. So Bert was in the thick of all of this. It's kind of amazing. When he left to go to China, he sent a message to his wife, said, "See you Thursday," and left for several years. She actually put that in the newspaper, when they had their divorce proceedings. It was pretty funny. He got involved with Elizabeth Champlain, who would become yet another Burt Hall wife. He ended up getting involved in the aircraft deal with Douglas Aircraft. Shoemaker had a license to sell Douglas Aircraft to the Chinese. Douglas Aircraft undercut their own representative and sold direct to them. And it cost Bert quite a bit of money. He got arrested for his involvement with that. He had taken some money as part of an advance. When the Chinese wanted it back, he told them no. Had to turn the money back over. Bert got out of that legal mess. But he never really forgave Douglas Aircraft. He went on to sue them again. And he also wanted a little bit of revenge on the Chinese. Go ahead. I call it one-man swindle. Bert goes back, he comes back to the United States for a few years, gets involved in Hollywood. He's involved with William Wellman, Reginald Denny, other guys that are in the area. Apparently Reginald Denny owned a hobby store where he sold model aircraft, and Bert would come in every Saturday. It was a big deal for all the kids. A lot of fun. But Bert goes back to China, and he gets involved with General Ho Chu Kao. This guy was seriously the wrong, he's like a Bond villain. He's just, his own representative to Bert's party, he tortured him to find out information about Burt Hall. It came out in court. It was like, they physically tortured him. Bert decided he was going to become an arms dealer. He was also in the process of buying a bar and a casino. That would have been good. But he got into an elaborate arms deal where he was selling German surplus World War I munitions to one of the factions in China. He didn't have any of the guns, never procured the guns, but he took the money. Bert got on a boat with his girlfriend, who was his child's babysitter, who he had brought to China with him. I can't make this stuff up. He brought his babysitter to China with him, but left the wife at home with the kids. Came over with her. They got on. Now, when they realized everything was going bad, Bert got on a boat, and they had to stop in Japan before going on to China. Now, the authorities were wired ahead to intercept Burt Hall, but he had given his girlfriend the money. So they captured Hall, the money went on to the United States, but Bert went to jail. They brought him up in the consulate court. I love the quote from the judge. "I don't believe a word you have said about there being another person implicated in the deal. I don't believe your papers were taken by Japanese authorities. You planned to steal this money. You lived around with this woman for 18 months living by your wits, and then you planned to get away with this money." And Bert was like, "Sorry." He was unabashed about it. He was sentenced to McNeil Island. Paul Rockwell had a heyday with this. The Trench and Air Association, which he ran, he's like, Burt Hall finally got his comeuppance. We all knew he'd end up in a federal penitentiary at some point. Really seemed to enjoy that. We'll go ahead. Most people, that would have been the end of their career, but Bert kind of picked himself up, dusted himself off. That's why I like him. He came back to Hollywood. He was involved in a number of different things, including a consultant on a Shirley Temple movie. Today you wouldn't put a young kid near that. But Burt Hall, man, he really came back. There's actual photographs in Dennis Gordon's book of Burt Hall with Shirley Temple. It's just incredible. He filed a lawsuit against Douglas Aircraft and won. Got $40,000, which for the era was a lot of money. He went back to China. I found a State Department record where he was snitching on arms sellers in China, and they said, "This comes to us from a trusted agent, Bert Hall." Well, Bert had always claimed, if you think of his autobiographies, Bert's always claimed later in life that he was a spy all along for the government. This is about the only tangible piece of evidence to that, and I personally don't think he was a trusted agent. 1941, he was running a hotel in New York for a while, and he moved to the Dayton area where he claimed he was working for the government. During the war, it was kind of interesting. A couple things came out. One of his sons, Donald Jordan Hall, went to fly for the British. And there's actually a picture of him with Clayton Knight, who had formed the Clayton Knight Commission to train American pilots to go. They went up to Canada and trained, and then they went over. And they were letting him wear his Lafayette Flying Corps wings, his father's Lafayette Flying Corps wings. Now, I couldn't find a lot of records. The British are really funny about releasing the World War II personnel records. But I did find several accounts of Donald Hall being shot down several times. So we know he was involved in fighting in Africa. Kind of a remarkable, if you think about it, we missed the book from Donald Hall where he could have told all of his exploit stories like his father. Later in life, his son Norman Hall actually went on to become an IndyCar racer, raced in the Indianapolis 500. He told some great stories. He said, I'll never forget, Bert would show up with one of his wives at random at an ex-wife's house to meet the kids and just show up. One night he dropped off the wife, went to a poker game, came back with a taxi cab that he had won in the poker game. Yeah, but had lost the family car at some point. You know, so you can just imagine if you were trying to deal with Bert, you know, how much fun it is. It's a great shot of him with Robert Ripley and Edith, I can't remember her last name, first female, licensed female pilot. Looking at John will remember. I know her name's Edith.
Quimby.
But he went on Robert Ripley's Believe It or Not as one of the, and he was still claiming to be the first American aviator to fly from the Balkans War. So he completely embraced one man's war just because it was easier than trying to disclaim it and tell the truth. Go ahead. You know, strangest thing of all, Bert ended up in Castilla, Ohio. It's over by Sandusky. And he ended up owning the Sturdy Toy Company. And you know, his last few years of his life were kind of sad because he went to Rotary Club meetings and, you know, various schools to speak, but the turnouts were 10 or 12 people. You know, nobody wanted to hear about World War I aviators after World War II. You know, that wasn't the thing. He did die of a car accident, had a heart attack while he was driving and crashed the car in 1948. Pictures here, again, thank God for eBay. I was able to actually find some of Burt Hall's toys. For those who were in the Washington chapter, I actually brought them in. But you couldn't make these today. They all had nice, jagged metal edges. Horribly painful, dangerous things. It was kind of sad because when Bert died, an announcement, literally, it was in Time magazine, that Bert would be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. I've checked the Arlington records. They said, we have no record of that. Bert wasn't buried there. He was actually, somebody contacted Arlington and told them that Bert had never served in the American forces, didn't deserve to be buried there. Elizabeth, his last wife, reached out to the Lafayette Memorial and said, can Bert be interred here? And, and Paul Rockwell actually penned the letter saying no. Bert is not entitled to be interred here. She actually made the offer, could he be buried in the arch? In other words, don't be buried in the crypt, could his ashes be put in the arch? And they said there's no place for him here. Paul Rockwell's venom just never ended with this. You know, on his very last flight, a friend of Bert's took him back to Higginsville, Ohio, and the urn. Flying over his hometown, he opened the urn to dump Bert out. Of course, Bert blew back in his face. Kind of Bert's last ta-da. You know, it's kind of sad because Bert, you know, when you get down to it, you're talking 5 or 6 victories that can be confirmed. One of the original members of the Lafayette Escadrille, definitely one of the more colorful members. Did things his entire life that today you couldn't do. You know, in many respects, especially having that many ex-wives and divorces. But you know, his daughters really went through it. His daughter that he left in France actually reached out to Groves at one point. They had medical bills they couldn't pay. Groves ended up selling copies of the Lafayette Flying Corps book from Bart Hall and donated the money to them. There was a lot of bad blood, but Bert didn't seem to mind this. I will say this. One of the things that really stood out was how much Paul Rockwell really spent his life kind of trying to change, you know, the history of the Escadrille and write Burt Hall out of it. And when you go through the records down Washington Lee, when historians were writing books, they would write Paul Rockwell, and he would write these terrible things about Burt Hall. Some of those ended up in the books, and I think that's clouded a lot of our history of what we think of this guy. But in the end, he was definitely a character. Yeah. Any question? I think that's it. I always like this one, Bert standing way off to the side. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you mentioned in your first notes that he was named after a boarder at his mother's boarding house.
Yeah.
Could all this be kind of a heretic? Why was he named after a boarder?
I have no idea. We actually found that through the census records. They actually had the guy listed there. Weston Birch was living in the house. I'm like, well, that's who he had to be named after.
I don't know. Some people named him after the father.
Yeah. I wouldn't rule rule out anything. Yeah.
What was Tano's opinion of Burt Hall?
You know, it's interesting. When you read Tano's book, Hall is mentioned twice in the entire book of the Lafayette Escadrille. Yeah, he never really said too much about Burt one way or the other, although he never said anything bad about Cowden either. I think he was more of a gentleman and didn't say anything bad about the gentleman that he didn't like. But there was definitely a feeling that by that period when Tano's book came out, etc., there was a lot of effort to just not include Burt in the descriptions. Even when you read Parsons' book, he goes through a chapter of each member of the founding member of the Escadrille, but Burt Hall gets 6 references in the entire book. Yeah.
Were any of his medals legitimate?
Oh yeah, quite a few. And I brought along the movie, the film, The Romance of the Air. I finally tracked down the only copy and got a copy burned. So you guys can see that they actually showed his legitimate medals in 1918.
Including Romania?
Yes.
Well, in regard to Romania, there's a picture of him standing beside a Nieuport 11, I believe, with markings that we finally figured out were most likely Romanian, red, yellow, and blue. And Romania, at the time he came out there, was already past saving. It had jumped into the war like Italy, thinking the time was right, but in its case, it badly underestimated things and ended up being invaded by the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. And the French were sending in second-rate equipment to try and prop up its air service, and the Russians launched an offensive trying to bail Romania out, which is how he probably made his way to Russia. And it's conceivable he may have scored that victory in late January, but by the end of January, Romania was formally out of the war. So if he scored anything after that, it might have been with the Russians. But I guess the reason he's not acknowledged as an ace is because all that was rather vague under the chaotic conditions under which Romania finally folded.
One more question, guys.
On there, there's got a Sparge is large aircraft, included to be used for fighter planes. And he mentions, so why build them? On one plateau in France, dozens of them may be seen out in the open going to ruin. Not a success, very bad investment. So does anybody know about what he's talking about, the plateau in France?
I didn't probe into that at all.
Dozens of the large French aircraft abandoned and going to ruin.
It could be places, Belleville, the airfield that was a bomber field, not too far from Paris, north of there, because it was a plateau.
Yet another issue to be solved in the bar tonight. Thank you, Blaine. Thank you very much.